This morning, Desmond Hogan from the philosophy department at Princeton University, speaking on Kant's theory of divine and secondary causation.
Thank you, Nancy, and I'd like to thank Eric for inviting me to this wonderful conference. It's been a great experience. I'm going to be talking about a topic that has come up since the beginning of the conference, that is the issue of divine secondary causation, and in particular this debate between the concurrentists and the mere conservationists. I was introduced to this when I was at Yale, a student of Bob Adams, particularly Sakje Lee. Unfortunately, he isn't here today. He wrote his dissertation on concurrence in Leibniz. So I held out hope that when I turned to Kant at some stage and I had time, I would look at this and find that there were answers to some of the problems about concurrence that Leibniz raised. Unfortunately, this is one of those instances in which Leibniz is just, I think, better and more sophisticated than Kant, and I don't think Kant has anything really great to add. So in that respect, I was disappointed, but still it's worthwhile figuring out where he stands in this entire debate and what his arguments are and what they're like and so on and so forth. So in this paper, I intend to discuss Kant's theory of God's relation to the causality of created beings, secondary causality as it's traditionally known. Kant's main contributions to a venerable debate on this issue can be approached along two intersecting metaphysical axes. One issue to which his early work in particular devotes considerable attention is the character of God's contribution to cosmological relations among created entities. And Kant's pre-critical writings develop a distinctive model of this divine contribution as a component of an interactionist cosmology whose targets include Leibniz's pre-established harmony and Malebranche's occasionalism. I'm not going to talk very much about that axis. There's a lot of good work done on that in recent years, particularly by Eric Watkins here. A second and related problem, which I will discuss, occupies Kant throughout his life. It's the mode of divine causal activity in nature more generally, or the general division of causal labor between God and created beings. And the central question he faces here is a traditional one for a theistic metaphysics. How does the activity of God, viewed as primordial creator and conserver of the world, relate to the causal activity, if any, of created beings? Kant accepts the position of many predecessors that a theory of God's causal role in the ordinary course of nature is a prerequisite of any coherent metaphysics of miraculous interventions. His own evolving account of this role is shaped by his ongoing engagement with three competing theories of divine causation, distinguished in late scholastic philosophy and vigorously debated in the modern period by Malebranche and Leibniz. The first of these theories is occasionalism, whose full-fledged version holds that God is the only true cause, solely responsible for all effects in nature. There is no genuine secondary causation at all, according to occasionalism. God produces everything in nature by his own power, and finite substances and states count as causes only in the attenuated sense of providing occasions for God to act and produce effects in accordance with his own decrees. Malebranche, the most influential occasionalist of the modern period, maintains that, quote, the nature and power of each thing is nothing but the will of God. All natural causes are not true causes, but occasional causes. Another theory of divine causation, Freddoso labels mere conservationism, or conservationism I call it, is associated with the 14th century Dominican theologian Girandus of Saint-Poussin. On this view, immediate divine action in the ordinary course of nature is limited to God's action in conserving created beings in existence. These conserved beings are regarded as capable of producing effects through their own powers without any additional divine action. So in contrast to occasionalism, mere conservationism treats finite substances as genuine causes of natural effects and their actions as their own and not God's actions. General concurrence, or concurrence, is a third theory of divine and secondary causation, widely endorsed in late scholastic theology and the early modern period. It agrees with conservationism and occasionalism that finite substances depend completely for their existence on God's creative and conserving action. It sides with conservationism against occasionalism in holding that there is genuine secondary causation. But concurrence claims that production of any effect whatsoever by creatures in the ordinary course of nature requires a divine action going beyond their mere conservation. The view holds in particular that God must also act as immediate co-cause of every naturally produced effect, through a cooperation or concurrence with the creature's powers, one in which neither causal contribution alone suffices for the effect. Concurrentism thus posits a more intimate and extensive divine involvement than conservationism in the production of natural effects, while opposing the occasionalist conclusion that God does everything and creatures nothing. So while Kant rejects occasionalism throughout his life, his objections to occasionalist arguments aren't always explicitly spelled out, and identifying these objections is thus one task in evaluating his own position. Kant's contributions to the concurrence-conservation dispute are also at the heart of his mature theory of divine causation. In spite of their significance for his theory of grace, these contributions have gone more or less unexamined. One reason for the neglect is that medieval and modern debates on concurrence and conservation were until recently poorly understood, at least by most people. Ferdosa's influential scholarship on the late medieval concurrence debate has advanced our understanding of the issue in the modern context. Ferdosa points out that mere conservationism was not, as one might expect, the default position for medieval opponents of occasionalism. Conservationism was rejected as philosophically and theologically deficient by nearly all scholastic participants in the divine causation debate. It continued to be regarded as suspect well into the modern period. It's rejected by Leibniz and dismissed by Malebranche as untenable in every respect. Common objections included the claim that conservationism issues in a deistic metaphysics, failing to respect the absoluteness of creaturely dependence, and also that it's incompatible with Christian orthodoxy on grace. Kant's German predecessors generally follow Leibniz in rejecting conservationism in favor of concurrence. Kant himself, while heavily influenced by this theological tradition, rejects concurrence in favor of conservationism. So one question this obviously raises is whether his departure signifies sympathy for the more deistic position with which conservationism was traditionally associated. So I'm going to begin by investigating Kant's early response to an influential occasionalist argument proceeding from premises regarding creation and conservation which are close to his own views. Sections 2 and 3 I'm going to skip over here because I don't have time for them. They concern his early stance in the conservation and concurrence debate. A familiar narrative emphasizes Kant's increasing discontentment with the metaphysics of the schools in the period leading up to the critical turn. The influence of this narrative has tended to obscure his insistence from the 1760s that some divine interventions in nature are probably necessary. And this doctrine is rooted in a major shift in his metaphysics of agency, which has consequences for his subsequent approach to divine and secondary causation. What I am going to focus on then is the evolution of Kant's thought on divine causation into the critical period, focusing on his opposition to concurrentism. Examination of the arguments, I will say, reveals that Kant's conservationism is not motivated by a rejection of theistic orthodoxy regarding the absoluteness of creaturely dependency. The metaphysical continuity with his earlier view is also striking. There's reason to conclude that the most significant milestone in the development of Kant's critical theory of divine causation does not lie in the transition from pre-critical to critical philosopher, but in an earlier one from necessitarian to libertarian regarding human agency. The notion that the critical philosophy just dispenses with or forbids metaphysical theorizing regarding God's relation to creaturely causes nevertheless remains widespread. It's best dispelled by attending to Kant's own writings, which display no scruples about insisting on the correctness of a particular model of the relation, but this does make it necessary to examine how the proposed model relates to transcendental idealism, and particularly how its correctness can be affirmed by Kant in the face of his critical strictures on knowledge. Okay, so section 1, creation, conservation, secondary causation. So Kant's early writings subscribed to a pluralistic substance metaphysics, presenting God as creator and conserver, Urheber und Erhalter, of all finite existence through his will, and the ontological ground of possibility itself through his understanding. The theme of ontological dependence is a prominent one throughout his early writings. It finds expression in a claim that whatever exists, whether it is possible or actual, is only something insofar as it is given through God. In particular, Kant accepts the view of Descartes, Malebranche, and Leibniz that finite substances do not depend on God merely at the moment of their creation. The contingency of finite substances is held to entail complete dependence on divine conserving activity subsequent to creation. This conservation Kant describes as actuation of continued existence as opposed to creation as first production of the world. His early thought does not reject an orthodox Christian view of the universe as of finite age and its creation as an event in time. While his mature idealism demands a different understanding of creation, he continues in mature works to describe his metaphysical position as theism and to defend the doctrine of creation. He also continues to describe created entities as, quote, only perduring through a continuous divine act. As much power as was required for the creation of substances is needed for their conservation. Now, the strong emphasis on the ontological dependence of creatures in Kant's early and mature writings raises questions about his lifelong opposition to occasionalism. The opposition is not itself in doubt. Created substances are presented in his earliest works as subsistent entities endowed with active and passive forces causing an array of effects in nature. What is not so obvious is how Kant proposes to respond to Malebranche's argument that the ontological dependence of creatures already forces acceptance of an occasionalist model of God's relation to created causes. One of Malebranche's most influential arguments for global occasionalism rests on the principle that divine conservation amounts to continuous creation. I'll call this the CCC principle. It's rooted in the idea, accepted by Aquinas, Suarez, Descartes, Leibniz, and Kant, that the ontological dependence of finite substances subsequent to creation remains such that they would immediately cease to exist were God to withdraw his conserving support. Such a lack of existential inertia is presented as an immediate correlate of creaturely contingency, and it motivates an account of creatures' conservation as metaphysically symmetrical with creation. As Leibniz explains, quote, "The dependence of creatures being as great in the sequel as in the beginning, the extrinsic denomination of being new or not does not change its nature." So one of Malebranche's central arguments for occasionalism sets out from this idea. It begins with the claim that God cannot create a body, in his example a chair, without at the same time willing that it exists either here or there, and without his will placing it somewhere. The idea here is that creation requires the fixing of some or other complete set of properties. It's impossible for God to create a chair in general. Since the created entity did not exist prior to its creation, Malebranche concludes that its essay and initial properties must be entirely fixed by God at the moment of creation, leaving nothing undetermined to be caused by the created entity at that instant. He then generates the occasionalist conclusion by extending the argument to all created entities, caveat here which, based on Bob's talk the last day on the issue of finite wills, and generalizing the argument using CCC to all times. So we have this passage, "Creation does not pass because the conservation of creatures is, on God's part, simply a continuous creation, a single volition subsisting and operating continuously. Now God can neither conceive nor consequently will that a body exists nowhere, nor that it does not stand in certain relations of distance to other bodies. Thus, God cannot will that this armchair exists, and by this volition create or conserve it without situating it here, there, or elsewhere. It's a contradiction, therefore, for one body to be able to move another." So the final sentence adds to the thought that there is nothing left undetermined at creation by God, the idea that the creature cannot modify or override God's creative choices. Kant offers no explicit response, though his early writings exhibit familiarity with Malebranche. On one interpretation, he might be taken as rejecting Malebranche's extension of the claim that God does everything and creatures nothing beyond the instant of creation. While Leibniz, Wolff, Baumgarten, Meyer accept the CCC principle on which the extension rests, some Kantian texts suggest resistance. On the one hand, he affirms, even into the critical period, that, quote, "There is no distinction between creation and conservation with respect to God, since in God's case we cannot distinguish beginning and continuation. It's one act, a distinction is made only in the world," end quote. The same transcript continues, however, by warning that conservation, quote, "cannot be called creatio continua because creation is the production of the ortus or beginning. A continuous beginning is contradictory. We cannot make any concept of it." Given Kant's initial affirmation of symmetry, it's not clear whether his qualification denies that the symmetry is sufficiently robust for Malebranche's purposes. Such a denial would not have been unprecedented. While the CCC principle finds broad support in 18th century Germany, Leibniz already records some opposition, and in Kant's day, the principle is rejected by Crusius, a major influence on his early thought. Another, and I think more promising approach to Kant's early rejection of Malebranche's occasionalist conclusion views him as rejecting the argument's premise that God does everything and creatures nothing, even at the instant of creation. Malebranche rests this key move on an intuition that, quote, "Only he who gives being could give the ways of being, since the ways of being are nothing but beings themselves in this or that fashion." Leibniz's response must be viewed as relevant here, given Kant's explicit acknowledgement of his influence on his earliest causal realism. Leibniz maintains that CCC can be affirmed and yet occasionalism averted by marking distinct orders of causation within a single instant. In this lovely passage from the Theodicy 388, Let us assume that the creature is produced anew at each instant. Let us grant also that the instant excludes all priority of time, being